good morning and welcome to the Rotary World Affairs Conference on Peace and Conflict Resolution. Peace and conflict resolution is one of the 6 areas of focus of our Rotary Foundation. Rotary Foundation is ranked with 4 stars from Charity Navigator, which is the highest ranking and was ranked as the #1 foundation in the world by the International Association of Fundraising Professionals at their conference last year. And you may ask why. It's because all the projects we're doing worldwide, everyone's a volunteer, and of every dollar that we receive as a donation, 90 cents of each dollar gets to the actual intended recipient, which is rated obviously outstanding. The other 6 areas of focus beyond peace and conflict resolution are water and sanitation. We've learned over the years that in many areas of the world they have no water, so we've done our water projects. One that comes to mind was in Guanajuato, Mexico. We went to 27 different rural communities and put in a water tank. Prior to our district showing up, they were capturing all their water off of rusty tin roofs and storing it in rusty barrels. You can only imagine the health implications for families and for children. And of course, we quickly learned that with water you must have sanitation, and you would think that'd be just a common sense thing, but if the only area you've ever had for a source of water is that dirty stream or river out back, the same stream that's used as livestock, then it takes some education. So we're proud to be a part of that. Another one is supporting education, and I would tell you that also focuses on water projects, and you might say, how do the two connect? Well, they connect because in many parts of the world, girls and women spend 90% of their day hauling water. So if we have good, clean water as a source for them, it frees those girls and women up for education and for literacy. And then we have growing local economies, and sometimes that starts with a water project, like one we did in the Dominican Republic. Started as just building a water tank to hold to store the water to where they wouldn't have to be hauling it all day. But then the next year, irrigation from that started to produce a specialty crop in that area. The lush vegetation, they were able not only to feed their families, but beyond that, they were able to sell the excess so that they could provide education for their children and for dental services. Saving mothers and children, we're quite involved with prenatal care for mothers and children. We're spending quite a bit of time with teaching midwives around the world, and that's very popular in some areas of the world. And then fighting disease. One of the things that we're working on is eradicating polio, which probably wouldn't mean too much to any of you, but would certainly mean quite a bit to your grandparents. When we started our campaign, there were 350,000 cases of polio around the world. This year to date, we're only at 20, and we're down to 20 countries, or 2 countries, when at one time it was 125 countries. We have immunized close to 3 billion children with the polio vaccine. So why peace? Well, conflict and violence displace millions of people around the world. Specifically, 65 million children and people are displaced by armed conflict or persecution. Half of those killed in conflict are children, and 90% are civilians. Rotary has raised $142 million in regard to promoting peace. We have over 1,000 peace scholars around the world. It's a master's program. I like to refer to them as pockets of peace across the globe. So what does Rotary have to offer to you? First off, youth exchange. What a better way to understand people and their culture than to participate in youth exchange? We sponsor over 9,000 students a year worldwide from the ages of 15 to 18. And they spend that year abroad learning and living and being immersed in the culture of the country they go to. Each of these scholarships equals about $25,000. So I would encourage you to be a part of that. And we actually participate in 35 different countries. And then we have 2 programs that are scholarships that are $7,000 each for a student to study abroad. And if you would have an interest in that, once you get at that college level, just contact your local Rotary Club and we'll be able to assist you with this. The premier scholarship we offer is called the Peace Fellowship. And that fellowship is a master's program, and that scholarship supports the mission of the Rotary Foundation, of Rotary International, to advance world understanding, goodwill, and peace by increasing awareness of and respect for cultural differences by sending ambassadors of goodwill, which are those students, to study in another country, and developing leaders who can address the human needs. The value of that scholarship is around $50,000. So as you get into your college years and start to get towards that master's program, consider any of these programs, either that study abroad program, which is while you're in college, the master's program afterwards, or right now, youth exchange. The applications for these are always at different times of year, so the best way to reach them out is just to your local Rotary Club. And right now, you have 2 local Rotary Clubs here in Fort Wayne, actually 3. We started a new one, Summit City South, on the south side of town. You know, in the words of Mother Teresa, never worry about the numbers. If you want to help somebody, just help one person at a time and start with the person closest to you. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how many great things you've done or how much money you've earned or how many diplomas you have. It will come down to, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was naked and you clothed me. I was homeless and you took me in. If you aren't already, you can make a difference in your community and across the globe. Be that person that makes the difference. Be that inspiration. On behalf of those less fortunate, again, welcome.
Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to give you just a quick overview of what we're going to do today. This morning, there'll be 2 presentations. We have 2 very fine speakers that'll be presenting, and following that, we will have an open question session where you'll be able to interact with the speakers. I'd like to point out that we have a microphone right over here, so once we start the questions, if students would come down that side wall and then line up to go to that microphone. At this time, it gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Meg Gardner. Dr. Gardner is Associate Professor of Global Leadership at Indiana Tech, a global education specialist with over 2 decades of academic and professional experience. Dr. Gardner holds an education master's degree in international education development from Teachers College, Columbia University. She also holds a PhD in education from Cornell University. Prior to joining the Indiana Tech faculty, Dr. Gardner was an assistant professor of international and intercultural education at Florida International University, where she taught graduate classes on international education development, human rights and global citizenship, intercultural competency, and global education policy. She has extensive experience working with international peace and justice organizations. For example, 2001 to 2003, she was the global campaign coordinator for the Hague Appeal for Peace, Global Campaign for Peace Education, and an alternative representative to the United Nations for the International Peace Research Association. She also has worked as a consultant for the UN Global Teaching and Learning Project, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which you might know as UNESCO, and the Open Society Foundation in Albania. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Meg Gardner. Thank you.
Wow, good morning. This is an incredible honor, so I want to thank Rotary for inviting me here to speak to you today. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. I'm just really moved and incredibly honored to be speaking with you and interacting with you, and I echo the idea that this is going to be a very productive day, potentially transformative. So I hope you're paying attention. Yeah, so I'm going to get started. That was a great introduction. Thank you so much. I'm going to offer a little bit of a reflective introduction to the concept of peace. Today I'm going to talk about different ways of thinking about peace, inspiring words from peacemakers, and steps that we can take, you can take, and we can take together to act for peaceful change. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit more about a couple of important people who were really instrumental in getting me to this point. And these people happen to be some of my really influential teachers who helped me to envision and enact peacemaking. Do we have any teachers here today? A couple of teachers? Oh, okay, way in the back. All right. Well, first I want to highlight my interaction with a really powerful high school teacher that I had. I grew up in Madison, New Jersey, far from here, and Emily Stile was my junior year English teacher. And she really opened a lot of doors for me in terms of introducing the idea of windows and mirrors. So using literature, she introduced the idea of encountering difference in others. She talked about the immigrant American experiences, and she helped us to learn about ourselves and at the same time learn about the differences of others. It really promoted empathy and intercultural understanding. And she had a powerful impact on me in high school. Then I went to college. And I went to Oberlin College, and I met a women's studies professor there named Gloria Watkins. I took a class with her on African American women writers. And she knocked my socks off. I had never been confronted in such a way as in her classes. I really had to rethink my positionality, who I was in the world. And soon I found out that this was not just Dr. Gloria Watkins. This was the one and only Bell Hooks, who's written numerous books on feminism, black women and feminist culture. And one of my favorite books that she wrote is called Teaching to Transgress. And it's all about education as the practice of freedom. I just have a quote from her here. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we're to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. That kind of transformative understanding of the learning process just really opened up my mind. And not only that, but she talked about intersectionality. She talked about the ways that race and class and gender affect how we are in the world and how we are positioned by others in the world. And that ended up being a very transformative lesson for me as I moved through the world myself. Then, after college, I took a few years off, traveled, did a few interesting things, and then I decided to go back to graduate school at Teachers College. And the reason I went to Teachers College was to work with this person, Dr. Betty Reardon. She inspired me. She is one of the founding members of a field of peace education. She's worked with the United Nations, but more importantly, she's worked with educators around the world to understand what peace looks like in different political, social, and economic contexts all over the world, and to see how educators can help promote peace in their local context. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about today have to do with Dr. Reardon's work and her model of positive peace and peace education. So based on kind of my reflections and my experiences with these teachers, I have three kind of core inquiries for us today. One is, how can we learn to better understand and appreciate those who are different from us? And for me, this is a cornerstone of peace building. The second question is, how can we interrupt everyday expressions of violence and injustice that cause harm? We know about the violence that's in our world today, but what can we do about it? So that's something to really think deeply about. How can we interrupt different forms of violence and injustice and really make the kind of change that we want to make? And finally, how can we begin to build a more peaceful and just world? How can we begin today to build a more peaceful and just world tomorrow? So that forward-thinking idea, envisioning a possible world that's different from the one we live in today, and how do we start today to build that world for tomorrow? So that's kind of 3 of the inquiries guiding this talk. But first, we need to think about peace. What is peace? What does it mean to you? So I'd like you to just take about a minute to do something I call a think, pair, share. So think to yourself, what does peace mean to you? Take even less than a minute and jot down a few words that come to mind. When you hear the word peace, or when you hear somebody talking about peace, what jumps into your mind? After you jot down something, share it with a neighbor, and hopefully I can get responses from 1 or 2 of the tables. Just take a minute. I'm glad that you're already thinking about this, and we see such a range of responses. This word cloud doesn't really capture all the responses that you gave and maybe all that you were thinking about. And as I said, we'll have time throughout the day to revisit this, I think. But one thing I want to talk about today that kind of reflects the variation in how we think about peace is the idea of peace as both a positive and negative. And you kind of touched on that when you mentioned the absence of something. So when we think about peace, we think of the absence of direct violence. And that's a very common understanding of peace. And direct violence meaning violence that we can identify the cause or the perpetrator, and we can see that it happened, and it was very immediate and direct. There was a perpetrator, there was a victim, and that was a violent act. So we see peace as the absence of direct violence. And this is what Betty Reardon talked about, and peace scientists talked about as negative peace, the absence of violence. But there's another side of that, which is in this image, the deeper kind of underpinning of peace, and that has to do with positive peace, the fulfillment of something. So if we have the absence of violence, what is it the presence of? What is the positive value associated with that kind of negative value? And here I'm using positive and negative not as bad and good, but as absence and presence. So again, negative peace, the absence of direct violence. You could say the absence of war. Well, we're at peace because we're not at war, some people say, or positive peace, meaning more about the presence of social economic justice. And again, you touched on a wide range, so this doesn't capture everything, but this helps us to unpack a little bit how we talk about and how we understand peacemaking and peace building. So it's a little bit hard to see, but this is an activity that I would love for us to revisit later on. But if we look at this in a kind of table, an analytic framework, I'm very analytic. So if we look at this in a kind of analytic framework, along the left-hand side of this table, you see 3 different kind of levels. A micro level, which we could talk about as the individual level. A meso level, which you could talk about the community level, the nation. And then a wider macro level, which you could talk about as global, or sometimes Betty Reardon talked about the planetary. And the notion that we were part of one planetary system. And then along the top, you have negative peace, with that definition, the absence of personal, physical, and direct violence. And then 2 other dimensions of positive peace. So the absence of indirect violence that shortens lifespan, and the absence of indirect violence that affects quality of life. So this idea of indirect violence is very important, and something that I want us to think about. So here I've kind of filled in some of this, but this is actually an activity that maybe later on we can fill in with you to think about some of these peace problems. So in this framework, yes, so we talk about the absence of direct violence as physical safety, protection from direct violence and harm. At the meso level, protection and security from, for instance, gun violence, and at the macro level, elimination of violent conflict and war. But let's look at the positive peace side. Indirect violence that shortens the lifespan. What does that mean? Here it says access to food security and health care. Well, without food security, without health care, lifespan is shortened. So it makes sense then to talk about peace building within that framework. At the meso level, we talk about ending systematic discrimination based on identity, based on hate. And these, again, impacting lifespan as well as quality of life. And finally, at the global level, we can talk about poverty and extreme poverty as both shortening lifespan and affecting quality of life. So when we think about the fulfillment of positive peace, we're not just thinking about the absence of direct violence and war, but also the presence of social justice and systems that affirm life and well-being. That's a bit of the framework that I wanted to share. So what then is everyday peacemaking? What can we do to be a part of building peace? For me, everyday peacemaking entails 3 interconnected steps. Not simple, but interconnected. So the first one is respecting and protecting difference. And many of you talked about that in your definition of peace. Respecting and protecting difference, learning with and from others, cultivating a wider lens by engaging with people who are different from you, who have a different perspective, who have a different life experience, and developing empathy. I'll never forget that lesson. Learning to care about the experience of others who are different from you. Yeah, maybe it wasn't your experience, but it was their experience. It was his experience. It was her experience. And you can care about that. And that's empathy. That helps us to build a safer world and a better world. Number 2, preventing direct and indirect violence. So expanding the notion of what we want to stop. Yes, we want to stop direct violence. We want to end gun violence, especially in schools and especially for youth. But we also need to look at indirect violence and those forms of violence that over time shorten lifespan and affect quality of life. So part of what we need to do is understand that, unpack that, investigate that, and then we need to act on that. We need to work in our communities, in our schools and communities at the national and the global level to prevent and end the kinds of direct and indirect violence that we see. And finally, we don't need to act alone. In fact, what we need to do is find others who want to act with us. So linking local and global action for change is very important. Sometimes you feel isolated, like this is just me. I'm just working on a huge problem. But there are thousands of others, and there are movements that we can connect with to feel that sense of solidarity. So what's important is to engage in hopeful action. It's easy to be cynical, it's hard to be hopeful, and that's what we need to be doing. Developing a sense of hope and collective action, envisioning alternatives. So how could the world be different? What could we build together if we tried, if we put our minds to it? And that's part of what happens in everyday peacemaking. So let me check here. Okay, good. Just a simple kind of visual here. If we think about the components of everyday peacemaking, promoting well-being, valuing difference, preventing violence, and connecting the local and the global. Now, there are a lot of critical peace problems that we could look at. Where do we start? I chose this one because it's very immediate. It's happening right now. And I found this data. It was a recent report, 2018. Hate crimes in the largest U.S. cities rise 12% to the highest level in over a decade. So this is data. I like to work with data. Data shows us that the prevalence of hate crimes, which is basically identity-based violence, is most often based on race, religion, and gender and sexuality. These are the 3 biggest forms of identity-based violence, but there are many others that exist too, and we can talk about that. But this is a critical peace problem for our time. I think we can take some time later on, because this is an in-depth activity that I'd like you to think about. But maybe just take a minute right now to make a note to yourself. identify an example of an identity-based identity-based violence that has affected you, your community, or your nation. So just think about it for a second. What is something that either has directly touched you or someone that you care about or that you know about? Just take a minute. One of the things, taking it down to a kind of a more local level, another area where we see identity-based violence is actually in schools. And we see a lot of difficulty related to gender identity, sexual orientation, even happening within schools. So this is a list of ways, just everyday acts, and ways that you can be involved in protecting, being an ally to a young person who may be experiencing the threat of violence or actual violence. So listening is a big part of that, and just being available to hear the stories and to listen. Developing a sense in yourself to respect, appreciate, and acknowledge those differences among you, and to be okay with those differences. This will allow you to be an ally to someone who's experiencing harm. Absolutely, if you're comfortable, and when you get comfortable, you can speak up. That's a role that you can take. You can speak up and act to interrupt when you hear bias or hurtful words in your school or in your classroom or in your community. But also be patient and do not expect another person to educate you about their identity. You know, that can be a big burden, especially if you're one of the only minority individuals or religious minorities or gender identity minorities in a classroom, to have to explain to everybody why you're different. You know, no, it's acceptance first and understanding over time. But we can't ask everyone to explain their difference, just as much as we don't want to explain our identities to everyone. So it's you know, asking someone to explain puts you in a difficult situation. Another thing that's a lifelong challenge is to become more aware of our own biases and to work to learn about others. This is a lifelong journey. We're doing this work in colleges, we're doing this work universities. Indiana Tech just hired a diversity and inclusion officer to help build diversity and inclusion on our campus. A lot of campuses around the country are bringing in new forces to promote diversity and inclusion. So learning about our own biases and how it affects our work with others is an important kind of lifelong thing. But it can start early. And then seeking opportunities to become more aware and to engage in support and guidance for others. So let's see. Okay. So we touched on this quote before. Mother Teresa, she's an inspiration, but I really like our first speaker was saying that, and I really believe these are such powerful words, because a lot of times when I think about the problems of peace, I think about what can I do individually. But I love how she says, I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. I think that's exactly what we're aiming for here. Like we said, one person, one at a time, and making that change. So everyday peacemakers, what can we do? Respect and protect difference, prevent direct and indirect violence, and link local and global action for peaceful change. And keeping the future in mind every day as we work towards envisioning peace. So working for peace in the future is to work for peace in the present moment. This is Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Buddhist philosopher, and he has written books on being peace and mindfulness. So for some of you who approach peace through the idea of harmony and kind of well-being and mindfulness, Thich Nhat Hanh is a wonderful resource. And actually, Thich Nhat Hanh has a wonderful relationship with bell hooks. And they've worked together to envision a more peaceful world in terms of meditation and mindfulness. So keeping that present moment in mind, you know, as we envision a better future. That's what it's about. Thanks.
I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Richard Rupp. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana. His education is pretty amazing. A BA from California State University in Hayward, an MA, a master's degree at California State University in Sacramento, and a PhD from the University of California in Santa Barbara. He's a native Californian. He's worked on a variety of political campaigns and has served as a Senate Fellow with the California Legislature before pursuing his PhD. His research and teaching interests center on international relations with a focus on cooperation among the major powers during times of armed conflict. His classes feature student-led simulations of international conflicts. You'll have some more opportunities to work through some of those issues later. Dr. Rupp has spent a considerable amount of time in the Balkans researching the wars in the former Yugoslavia. He has published several books and chapters and journal articles on the subjects. He's recently authored a book, NATO After 9/11, An Alliance in Continuing Decline. His research interests also include international security organizations, post-Cold War armed conflicts and humanitarian interventions, the NATO expansions. His teaching interests also include international relations, governments of the world, U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, post-communist Europe, nationalism and ethnic conflict in post-communist Europe, and government and political conflicts in Russia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rupp.
Good morning. Delighted to be here. I have to confess, usually I walk around the room to work the room, but given that we're taping this, I will not be doing that. I'll be kind of talking from up here. I want to congratulate for Rotary for putting this together. The gentleman who opened us, the governor of Rotary, I thought did a brilliant job of setting the stage for what Rotary does. But it's not just Rotary. There are many, many human beings and international organizations and nonprofits involved in what Rotary is doing. I think he said something along the lines that Rotary has raised over $150 million for these projects. That's really wonderful, but the United States spends about $700 billion a year on the Defense Department, right? So you see some dichotomies going on and where our priorities are. I'd also like to thank my friends from Purdue Fort Wayne for organizing this lovely campus. I'm from the campus in the Hammond area in Westville, near Hammond near Chicago. There are many ways of addressing conflict resolution. Really, almost every academic field you have here at the university at some level deals with conflict resolution, or at least identifying problems and solving problems. So when Rotary comes to the university and says, we would like you to do this topic, the logical one, conflict resolution, which immediately comes to mind, is what Professor Gardner and I do, international relations. But there are many ways of tackling it. I'm a political scientist, but there are many ways of attacking conflict resolution: psychology, early childhood development, biology, anthropology. So there are a lot of ways of picking and choosing how you tackle conflict resolution. Now, Dr. Gardner gave you kind of a positive presentation, a positive piece about what individuals can do and what they should do and how they should be organized. I have to tell you, I'm on the other side of that. I'm going to be the Darth Vader of the morning, talking about conflict resolution. See, in my field, I don't really deal with, you people. I deal with leaders of governments. I deal with nation states. I deal with international organizations. I deal with the interests of those states and the power of those states. My goal, frankly, is not frequently focused on peace. It's focused on stability. If I can facilitate a stable world, that's, in my opinion, one of the best things I can hope for in a very conflictual world. So today, I have a kind of a provocative topic: conflict resolution in the age of Trump. I thought we would begin, and here, John, I'm going to ask some questions, and so I know that he wants you to speak into the mic. But I have an opening question for you. That's the map of the world. Let's keep going. What would you say are the significant global challenges or crises currently confronting the global community? My next slide is a list, and let's see what you come up with. It's 2018, and some of these have been going on for many years. But you can just give me the terms, phrases. Yes, sir.
I would say the protectionist trade war going on between the U.S. and China.
Splendid. That's on the list.
Probably the human trafficking crisis that's going on between...
we've got a good group in the room. Excellent. And you know, Rotary did human trafficking. I led a presentation on human trafficking a couple of years ago. That's how cool Rotary is. You know, Rotary's trying to get young people involved because it's starting to look like an older organization, because a lot of the post-World War II organizations like Elks and like Rotary, the Masons, but we need young people, and having them do human trafficking was awesome. Yes, what else?
Current relations with North Korea and Russia.
I should think so. Run, run, run. Cutting into my time.
Refugees.
Refugees.
We're working not to cut into your time.
You're good?
I'm going to do a couple more. You're doing very well.
The opioid crisis.
The opioid crisis, not just in the U.S.
Human rights violations in several countries.
Every country. The U.S. State Department publishes a document every year delineating the human rights violations in every country of the world, and then the other countries write one on ours, because they're kind of annoyed that we go after all the other countries. Yes?
Decline of human contact from cell phone usage.
Oh, that's good. It's not on my list, but one more time.
Decline of human contact from cell phone usage.
Awesome.
The divisive nature of the political climate.
Great.
Do we have time for one more?
One more.
The Israeli and Palestinian conflicts.
That's on every year. So sad. That's one of my fields of specialization. I lecture on the Middle East. And what I tell students that I think when I retire in about 10 or 15 years, the only thing that will change from my PowerPoints about the Arab-Israeli conflict is updating the most recent war or the most recent conflict. I doubt very, very much after 50 years in this field that I will be reporting any good news. Okay, let's see how you did. Survey shows. Okay, so looks like you did awfully well. Not all, but there are many others. Refugees. I put the slaughter of wildlife. It's a particular interest of mine because African elephant and rhino are on the verge of extinction. It's a major conflict. And it's very fascinating trying to bring nations together on this particular issue. I mean, there are only about 450,000 elephant left in the wild, and we're still killing them, poaching them at 30,000 a year. So you guys can do the numbers. So there are many different issues that require conflict resolution. These are some of them. Next, what I'd like to talk about are, well, let me first talk about some of the key ones that I can't talk about them all. So let me just talk about a couple that I think are important, and in many ways they dovetail nicely into what Dr. Gardner was just talking about. I put troubled democracies up there and the rise of authoritarian leaders. I think that is one of our most significant problems in the world today, is the crisis of democracy and the rise of authoritarian leaders. It's going on all over the world. Particularly, though, distressing is it is happening in the Western liberal democracies. When Dr. Gardner was talking about positive peace, she was talking about basically the values of liberal democracy. Liberal with no reference to Democrats and Republicans, simply the core values of liberal democracy. Now, around the world, we are seeing some real foundational shakeage, if you will, to that commitment, that post-World War II commitment. You have some countries like Turkey, a country that I've spent many visits to over the years, and we're seeing a democratically elected president, President Erdogan, steadily move towards authoritarianism. We see it in Brazil yesterday, yes? We see a government elected, so it is a democracy because the people have voted in a government that we're kind of dubious about the level of commitment to liberal democracy. We see it in Venezuela. We're seeing it horrifyingly in the Philippines. But in some ways, more important is to take a look at Western Europe and the United States, because you are seeing the rise of authoritarianism. And when I use the word authoritarianism here, I'm not talking about right wing, because we use the word right wing and left wing in American politics quite a bit. Authoritarianism is more of a rejection of those liberal democratic values. We've seen it particularly in Poland and in Hungary. And what is Brexit other than a rejection of arguably the most important institution to build stability and peace in Europe, which was the European Union? That's what Europe spent the last 50 years doing, and now it's coming apart because one of the key actors is pulling away, and others are eager to do that as well. And then we look at the United States. And I will leave that for you to comment, and we can do that later. I promised my chancellor that I would not be political today. It's challenging, frankly, being a social scientist in this era, because my job as a social scientist is truly to be as objective and factual as I can, and also not to persuade you of my views. That's my job. Still, it's challenging, given the times that we live in. And talking about the United States as a historic leader in conflict resolution, it's an interesting time to be having this conversation. Other conflicts around the world, that's Europe breaking away. That's my friend Vladimir in Moscow. This is a very dangerous time in European-Russian relations. The gentleman who mentioned the South China Sea, for my money, one of the most dangerous future problems that we should be talking about and looking at. India-Pakistan, like the Middle East, is always a perennial problem, particularly with a number of nuclear warheads pointing at each other. Iran's nuclear arsenal, which doesn't exist, right? All of the nuclear weapons in the world. You see continuing presence of a substantial number of nuclear weapons. On the glass half full side, the world has done a pretty good job of reducing the number of warheads since the end of the Cold War. In 1990, 1991, the two sides, the Soviets and the Americans, had built arsenals totaling of about 50,000 warheads. The other nations of the world had probably a total of less than 1,000, but 50,000 warheads. We are now down to a number that's still very high, but substantially reduced. The issue of North Korea, South Korea, nuclear proliferation. I think we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Gives you a sense of the conflict that we potentially will be involved in. We're involved in it now. But what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more towards our topic today, conflict resolution in the age of Trump, is to comment on the historic role that American presidents have played in conflict resolution. Going back to Franklin Roosevelt, really the era of the American ascendancy really begins on December 7th, 1941. And from that point on, the United States has been the dominant global power, even though the Soviets gave the United States a run for the money. The United States has been a key actor in the globe that we live in. And it's played, two roles. At once, we've caused a lot of problems in the world. The number of conflicts that the United States initiated are not insignificant. Simultaneously, though, The United States has been probably the most important state for building institutions and regimes of conflict resolution. No country has spent more on these efforts and has been supported by Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. That's a very fair statement. I would say now your generation is in a new period. I would define the last 2 years as a defining break from what has transpired since the end of World War II. So my next question for you, and again, I'm going to ask folks to run around with the mics. How do governments resolve their conflicts? Or what tools do, I really misspelled, what tools do governments possess to engage and resolve conflicts? So when you think about governments and the tools that they have to engage North and South Korea, or climate change, or human trafficking, or nuclear proliferation, what tools does government have? Yes?
I would say internationally, governments typically use sanctions or other, trade-related, economically potentially suffocating advantages that they might have over another country, economy, et cetera.
Excellent. Oh, there are a lot more.
I would say treaties.
Treaties. Treaty would be defined as a binding rule of law between two or more countries. So the United States is the signatory to probably several thousand international treaties, some of great importance, some important, but they manage the post office. Yes?
I would say also their relationships with international bodies like the United Nations and the way that they can facilitate.
How does a state interact with international organizations? The primary being the United Nations, but there are numerous international organizations. So again, we're looking for the toolbox. What can President Trump turn to when he has a problem on his desk?
You can use national representatives to discuss issues with other nations and see if they can come up with a compromise?
Sure. You have diplomacy, right? Broadly defined. And frequently, successful diplomacy leads to international treaties.
Threats of war.
Threats of war. Don't count that out. Threats of war is a tool in resolving conflicts.
Twitter.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes. I hadn't thought about that, but of course it is. It is a vehicle of communication. Quick, fast communication.
As a parallel...
That the majority of the members of the State Department would wish did not exist.
As a parallel to threats of war, actual war?
Actual war.
And then my other thing would actually be a parallel to my previous point, which would be potentially flooding a market that a certain alliance would have an abundance of. So if you look at what OPEC could potentially do to Venezuela, since Venezuela's economy is largely
absolutely.
oil-based.
Of course, it depends on how powerful you are. The American toolbox is this big, and where do I want to go? Kenya's toolbox is on the floor, right? That doesn't mean that Kenya can't make life difficult for the United States. Just because you have the biggest toolbox doesn't mean you win your wars. It's hard for me to think of a war that the United States has won recently, right? With that $700 billion defense budget. Iraq, Afghanistan, these are not victories for military planners. Yes?
I would say some countries kind of pay them off, like America kind of did with Syria, with the whole nuclear thing going on there.
We've been paying off countries for years, but we're not the only ones. All the great powers usually buy off lesser powers. You see how not nice this is? You see how my toolbox is more negative peace, right? Dr. Gardner's is more positive peace. I'm a positive peace guy personally. My life is joyously happy. But in the world I live in, it's a dark place.
So probably like treating states as like they're toxic and just trying to cut off ties or just severing the tie in like?
Sometimes, not too frequently. The United States does do that more often than the other powers. For example, not recognizing Cuba for 50 years would be an example of not recognizing a government. Yes?
Using power and our success against other countries.
Absolutely. One of the powers, I don't have it on the tool list here, is something called soft power. Soft power is not so much economic power or military power, which is the bread and butter for guys who do my work. Soft power is more how you influence nations, how you try to make them want to adopt your system and values. Historically, the United States has been very successful at that. Witness how many legal refugees and illegal refugees come to the United States. Ronald Reagan used to call the United States a shining city on a hill. And part of that was our appeal. Hollywood is a major part of our appeal. Our industry, the very fact that the internet started out entirely in English was very, very helpful for positioning the United States. We still have large numbers of international students studying in the United States, although I would tell you, last year my campus enrollment dropped 25%. And I don't know what Fort Wayne's dropped by, but in that it's universal, I'm guessing it's a similar number. You can wonder about that in a little bit, because historically, part of positioning the United States for leadership was having those international students come to the United States. Now they're not, or at least a big percentage of them are not. So you nailed a lot of the tools for conflict resolution: diplomacy, negotiation, arbitration. There are international courts, international law and treaties, organizations. Certainly non-governmental organizations are major actors in conflict resolution, economic aid, sanctions, and war. I mean, that is how you resolve some of your conflicts. Those are the tools that are readily employed. How am I doing on time? Now, in the post-World War II era, the United States played a leading role in building and sustaining all of these organizations. The UN would not have come into existence without the United Nations, period. And then you see General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which was designed to facilitate trade amongst states. The World Bank was designed to have a substantial fund for loans for developing states. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was designed to prevent war reoccurring on the most bloody continent the world has ever known, which is Europe. How many of you have been to Europe? Okay. Oh, that's not nearly enough. Do you have a passport? How can I take you? Gang, you all have to have passports. Okay, talk to your parents today and go home and get a passport, because when you're off to college, I need you doing study abroad, all right? You just got to. The world is much bigger than Fort Wayne, Indiana, all right? So all of these organizations, the United States has played a very supportive role over. Now, mind you, it's not just because we're so altruistic and wonderful. A big part of it is that the United States saw itself and still sees itself as a global leader, and these institutions were helpful and are helpful to the United States in bringing nations together cooperatively to talk, to negotiate, and deal with conflicts. That's the purpose of these organizations, which each and every one of those presidents, Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative, have supported since the end of World War II. Probably the most significant actor here would be the United Nations. When we look at physical armed conflict in the world, we look at the UN as one of the key actors in engaging that conflict. You know, on an optimistic note, I had the wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen on the board right now. Actually, right now in 2018, the world is relatively peaceful. And what I mean by that is that we do not have very substantial wars currently underway, turning in low millions of fatalities. If you look at the Cold War years, and you look at Vietnam, and you look at Afghanistan, and you look at Korea, and you look at the horrible wars in Africa in the 90s and early 2000s, we're talking probably 20 million fatalities during this period. It was very peaceful for the United States and the Soviets because of those nuclear weapons, keeping the peace. But so the world was very violent during the Cold War. But I would say right now, we are at a low ebb. It might not feel that way, and with the reference to ISIS, that was not a war. That was a group of fanatics that were tackling an insurmountable goal, and they are failing. So that would be a war that the United States has largely prevailed in, although it wasn't that difficult compared to some of the other challenges. NATO was, like the UN, a central actor in endeavoring to promote peace and conflict resolution. NATO never fired a shot during the Cold War. It was classic deterrence. The Soviets and the Americans armed to the teeth in Europe, and they both recognized that war would be cataclysmic. And so consequently, they didn't go to war with each other. A lot of those other conflicts I just talked about were called proxy wars, where they did elbow for global prominence. So now, I'm going to talk a little bit about President Trump. And how would you describe President Trump's approach to conflict resolution? How would you describe President Trump's approach? I've got another slide with some ideas about how, watching the president for the last 2 years, how he approaches any conflict, because again, conflict, as we're talking about, could be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was, by the way, a week ago Tuesday. I was in Pittsburgh with a group of individuals from Northwest Indiana looking at the remarkable transformation that Pittsburgh has made in 40 years. Pittsburgh was really on the floor 40 years ago, socially, economically. And so we were there looking at this amazing success story. So I opened my cell phone the other day and I see the news. It's just devastating. So conflict resolution goes on many fronts, but primarily I'm focusing on international relations. So what do you got? How much time do I have? 10 minutes? No minutes. 6 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay.
Okay. Combative and aggressive.
Okay. Combative and aggressive.
I would say nationalism, especially as is apparent with his America First campaign.
Okay. Nationalist. Yes. Quickly. Are they going to cut me off? We'll have plenty of time to talk.
I'd say, I'm not sure which president this was, but he takes the same approach as that the president that said use your big stick. Like, you can see that, how he's sending troops down to the border now.
Okay. That's an interesting topic for us to take up, by the way, those 5,000 troops going to confront that incredible invasion that we are apparently confronting on our southern border. Couple more?
I know we usually use this term on just a national basis, but he uses his bully pulpit internationally as the president of a powerful nation.
This gets us to that Twitter remark. I mean, he has the full attention of the world like few other presidents ever had. And every president has always dominated global politics. Whenever I travel overseas, they know more. The American story is always on the front page of newspapers overseas. Never like this has it been. One more.
Just building a wall instead of facing it head on.
Okay. So these are some that I would say are very fair assessments about how President Trump approaches conflict resolution and tactics. A rejection of traditional U.S. diplomacy and multinationalism. The evidence is overwhelming on this front. An embrace of unilateralism. Unilateralism is not working in tangent with allies, but to basically go it alone. A critic of international organizations and treaties. He has been a steady critic of what those who argue what we need, he's a critic of in conflict resolution. Major cuts to the State Department, so that diplomacy and talking, not so much, and very substantial increases to the Defense Department. Highly critical of U.S. allies. almost belligerent with our traditional European allies. And I'm just going to say a new relationship with Russia. Some of the initiatives of President Trump include withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, which was signed by 195 other states, abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership with 12 Asian states, abrogating the Iranian arms agreement, withdrawing from the 1987 nuclear weapons agreement, and initiating a trade war with China. There's only so much time to let me talk. So, with that said, because I'm just going to close now and say we can take these issues and other issues up later, maps of the world. But I want to close on this question because I don't want you to think I'm just here bashing Donald Trump. And because I consider everything, by the way, I just said could have been said by a conservative or a liberal, a Republican or a Democrat. I consider it good social science, what I just put up here. But I have a question for you. Okay? Write it down. Has the United States government ever toppled a democratically elected government? One of the reasons, as you're writing, I'll just say this. American presidents, all of them, regularly say that this is the greatest country in the history of the world. It's just a mantra in American politics. I would tell you that in all of my travels, I've very seldom encountered any other international leader talking about the same way about their country. How do you suppose governments feel about the U.S.? How would you feel if one of your teachers in the back said, "I am the very best teacher at this school"? That's how that rhetoric is perceived, particularly when my students in what countries know the answers to this. So do I have answers? Do I have any answers? I see one hand. Oh, go ahead. Of course, the boy who knows everything. Go ahead.
With the Operation Desert Storm,
nope.
No?
Iraq's not a democracy. There was nothing to overthrow. Saddam Hussein was a violent dictator.
What about Kuwait?
Are you kidding? It's a divine right monarchy. Nope. You get credit for everything else, but quickly.
There was Germany before Hitler took over, before World War II. It was the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, but when we overthrew it, it was a fascist totalitarian state. So here are the answers. Iran in 1953, democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh. Guatemala in 1954, Arbenz. And Chile in 1973, Salvador Allende. All right? All overthrown by the United States government. I put that up there because I want to give myself some credibility and say it's a mixed story. It's a mixed bag, this country. It has been truly an amazing story of progress and success and contributions. At the same time, we have a very checkered past and present. And I think the rest of the day we'll be talking about those things. So thank you very much.